Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartfelt tales of love, loss, and the quiet strength that carries us through. Today's story takes us back to the rugged heart of 1884 Montana, where legacy ruled the land and love was the last thing anyone expected. It's a story of two strangers brought together by duty, but transformed by fire, silence, and unexpected grace. Subscribe to the channel to begin today's journey, a story about finding love where there was only land and discovering yourself in the eyes of someone who sees you completely. It was the summer of 1884, and the air over Bitter Creek Valley in Montana held that dry, weighty kind of stillness that made even the sky seem stubborn. Back then, land meant everything. A man's power wasn't measured in titles or money. It was measured in how many cattle roamed his range and how few words escaped his lips. The Morgans had both in spades. Their ranch stretched wide across the valley, 15,000 head of cattle, 60 hired hands, and a house so full of history it creaked with every breath. And at the head of it all stood my father, Clayton Morgan. He built the empire with his bare hands and an iron will, and he ruled it the same way. But this story, my story, isn't really about him. It's about the moment I stopped walking in his shadow and started living in my own skin. My name is Rowan Morgan, and for most of my life, I was a son shaped by silence. I learned to ride young, to read the land, to make decisions fast, and keep my face flat no matter the cost. Emotions were for weaker men. At least, that's what I was taught. I remember the moment things began to shift. I walked into my father's study one morning, the room thick with cigar smoke and old power, and without looking up from his desk, he said, "It's time." I didn't flinch. Time for what? He slid a folded envelope across the desk, and in a voice hard as boot leather, he told me I was to marry Delaney Rhodes that Saturday. I blinked, not out of shock, but disbelief. Delaney Rhodes. The name stirred something from the past, like the memory of a distant storm. Quiet girl, sharp-eyed. Her family had once been respected, but time and misfortune had worn them down to a whisper. Now she was the last of them, and apparently a good business decision. "She's still got her father's land," my father said. "Barely. She's the last of the Rhodes name. Joining with us makes sense." I crossed my arms. "So I'm breeding stock now." "You're a Morgan," he snapped. "You marry for land, for legacy, just like I did." I wanted to laugh or scream, but instead I stood there, jaw clenched, thoughts tangled like barbed wire. He hadn't even seen her in years. "You know what she looks like?" I asked. "Pretty enough, sharp enough. That's all that matters. You'll say the vows." Outside, the dust was high and the judgment higher. I walked past the stables, the bunkhouse, the fence line that marked the edge of the Morgan claim, and still, nothing felt solid. Delaney Rhodes. The name echoed. I remembered her the way you remember winter when it's summer, distant but undeniable. If the stories were true, time hadn't been kind to her. But if I was being honest with myself, a thought kept circling beneath the duty and expectations like a hawk above the plains. What if she isn't what they say? 2 days later, I stood at the front of the Bitter Creek Chapel, wearing my best black coat, boots polished enough to catch the light. The building smelled of cedar and old secrets. There were no roses, no music. Just wind through cracked wood and a preacher who owed my father a favor. Then the doors creaked open. She didn't glide or drift, she walked. Steady, calm, a simple dove-gray dress, high collar, no frills, a veil over her face like morning mist over the valley. I didn't expect much. Nerves? Maybe. Hesitation. But instead, she moved like someone who had practiced being underestimated. "Do you, Rowan Morgan?" the preacher asked. "I do." "And do you, Delaney Rhodes?" Her voice was soft, clear, and sure. "I do." I reached forward, lifted the veil, and time stopped. She wasn't plain, she wasn't fragile, she wasn't forgettable. Delaney had the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself. It simply was. Her eyes met mine, unflinching, unwavering, and in that one look, I knew I'd misjudged everything. Not because she was beautiful, but because she knew I hadn't expected her to be. She stood there, composed, untouchable, and suddenly, I didn't know whether I'd made the worst mistake of my life or the first right choice. The Morgan Ranch house didn't just loom wide, it held you. Every board and beam carried stories I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. After the ceremony, I held the door open for Delaney. She walked in, not like a guest, not like a bride, but like someone stepping into a place she'd already taken measure of. "This where I'm expected to stay?" she asked, voice even. I nodded. "Room down the hall's yours. Mine's across." No warmth, no welcome, just walls and expectations. She unpacked without fuss. A few books, a small photograph of her father in a wooden frame, a bundle of dried herbs. The kind of items that didn't just carry weight, they carried memory. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, shirt unbuttoned, elbows on knees, trying to understand what had just happened. We hadn't spoken since the veil came down. No nervous laughter, no gestures of affection, just two doors closing in quiet synchronization. The next morning, I stumbled into the kitchen, half awake, expecting empty silence. But Delaney was already there, seated at the table sipping black coffee, with the ranch's ledger book open in front of her. "You're reading the books?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "You left them out," she said without looking up. "Figured I'd learn how the place breathes before trying to change its lungs." I frowned, sat down opposite her. "You always talk like that?" She glanced up, eyes steady, only when people assume I'm not thinking. There was something in that moment. Not heat, not yet, but something real, like a door cracking open in the distance. A few days later, the fire came. I was out at the south fence line when the wind shifted. I smelled it before I saw it. Sharp, fast, wild. "Fire!" I yelled, racing back toward the barn. Ranch hands dropped everything. Buckets flew, curses rang out, and right there, in the middle of the chaos, was Delaney, boots soaked, sleeves rolled, hauling water like she'd been born doing it. "What the hell are you doing?" I barked. "Helping," she snapped back. "You'll get yourself killed." "So will your fence line," she shot, eyes flashing. And just like that, we were moving side by side, dousing flame and fighting smoke. She didn't falter. Not once. By the time it was over, our clothes were soaked, our skin streaked with ash, and the fire had left its mark on the land, but also on us. "You ever fight fire before?" I asked, panting. "No," she said, "but I've had to hold back worse." I looked at her then, really looked. Not just the soot on her face or the damp hair clinging to her cheek, but the way she stood, unshaken, unbent, alive. "You didn't have to do all that," I said quietly. "Neither did you," she replied. But we had, and somehow I knew we weren't just bound by a name or land anymore. We were beginning to understand something far more dangerous and far more powerful. Each other. Days passed. The ranch settled back into its usual rhythm. Fences mended, cattle grazed, men grumbled about the heat. But something had shifted in the air between Delaney and me. It wasn't exactly warm, not yet, but it wasn't cold anymore either. It felt more like a question waiting for an answer. One afternoon, I found her by the window, sunlight brushing across the pages of a worn book in her lap. Her focus was absolute. There was a calm about her, like she belonged in that light, like it had been waiting for her to sit there. "What are you reading?" I asked. "A training manual," she said without looking up. "Mustangs. Wild ones. Says they run until they don't." I let out a short laugh. "Sounds like me." She smiled, barely, but it was the first real one I'd seen since she arrived. I sat across from her, elbows on the table, suddenly needing to know something. "Why'd you say yes? To the marriage?" She looked up slowly. Not defensive, not startled, just honest. "Because I was tired of surviving alone." I swallowed, the weight of her words settling in my chest. "Not tired of being alone?" I asked. "No," she said, "just tired of pretending it didn't matter." Later that evening, we sat side by side on the porch, the sky opening wide above us, full of stars and unspoken things. Our coffee had gone cold, but neither of us noticed. I broke the silence first. "I misjudged you." "You weren't the only one," she said. "No? What did you expect me to be?" Delaney turned her head toward me, eyes steady and clear. Louder, dumber, meaner. I burst out laughing. It came from deep in my chest, real and raw, and she laughed too, just a little. But it was ease, and that was rarer than romance. The next week was the Bitter Creek Summer Fair, and we rode in together, her in a plain blue dress, me stone-faced beside her. But it wasn't me they whispered about. It was her. the woman no one had seen in years, the name no one expected to matter again. Delaney didn't shrink. She didn't paste on a smile. She walked steady, eyes scanning, chin high. When two town wives made comments loud enough to hear about how she sure didn't say much and was plainer than expected, Delaney simply turned to them, cool as Riverstone. My father used to say, "Talk less, let your work speak louder." They blinked. One even stammered, "Would you like a slice of pie?" "Only if you're sharing it honestly," Delaney replied. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was better. It was a shift, a thaw. As we walked back toward the horses, I said, "They expected someone smaller." She didn't look at me when she answered. They weren't the only ones. And somehow, right then, I understood. She didn't just carry herself like she belonged here. She carried me too, without even trying. The night came slow, like it knew something sacred was about to be spoken and didn't want to interrupt. I sat on the porch steps, boots off, a glass in my hand, staring at the stars like they might answer questions I hadn't yet dared to ask. Delaney stepped out barefoot, cardigan wrapped loosely around her shoulders. She didn't say a word, just sat beside me, close enough to feel, quiet enough to understand. "You ever wonder," I asked, "if life would have been simpler if we hadn't said yes?" She sipped her tea, eyes on the horizon. "I don't think I ever knew simple," she said, "even before." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I didn't want this marriage, not because of you, just because I didn't know how to be anything other than what my father told me to be. She didn't flinch. "You're meeting me now," she said. "Is that enough?" "Only if you mean it," she whispered. "And if you're brave enough to keep meaning it." I reached out, not to grab, not to claim, just to rest my hand on hers. And she didn't pull away. No kiss, no promises, just the quiet kind of connection that heals more than it hurts. "I never imagined you," I said. "That's the thing about real things," she replied. "They don't need imagining, just seeing." And under a sky full of stars, not like wishes, but like promises, we finally began. Thanks for listening to this episode of Life Stories. If you enjoyed this journey and want to hear more tales of love, legacy, and the human heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay updated with our newest videos. See you in the next story.